Welcome. Hurricane Sandy is not over for thousands in the tri-state area, still repairing their homes, living in temporary housing, or in mourning. It will be an especially painful Thanksgiving tomorrow for more than 100 local families who have lost loved ones. The high water that brought this hell for so many is forcing government to rethink our infrastructure. Where to rebuild? How can transportation and the electric grid better resist the wind and water next time? Our first guests think we should include the internet on the list of critical infrastructure. We'll meet them in a moment. Also on the agenda today, the high school football team from the Rockaways that refused to forfeit to Sandy, why housing segregation continues despite the law, an investigative report, and you think you know African art? Think again. First, the web and the superstorm. Maybe when there's no light or heat, FEMA should float Wi-Fi blimps above the trouble to coordinate relief and keep us in touch. That's just one idea from people who think about a digital defense against disaster. Joining us, three tech experts leading the charge on this front. Personal Democracy Media founder Andrew Rasiej, New York Tech Meetup Managing Director Jessica Lawrence, and via Skype, OccupySandy.org Technology Manager Michael Badger. Welcome to all of you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And Andrew, in a hurricane and any kind of disaster, the web might not be the first thing that many people think of as critical. Why is it?
Well, because it can actually connect people very quickly, much faster than even cell phone towers. So, Wi-Fi networks were used in Katrina to allow Mayor Nagy to call George Bush on Air Force One. Very quickly, you can build Wi-Fi networks that are more ubiquitous, create a mesh, and allow not just voice over IP phone calls to occur, but also for situational awareness, mapping, and for other access to information that's very critical to relief and recovery.
So, Jessica, you've been on the ground with so many examples of technology helping with the relief effort and the recovery effort. Tell us the story. Tell us the story from the beginning. Like, what was the first thing that had to get up, or what were the first ways that you discovered that people from the meetup were giving help maybe in some unexpected ways?
Well, we have over 28,000 members of the New York Tech Meetup, and so one of the first things that came to mind was we have a huge group of people with technology skills. There must be some way to mobilize them to get them to do work to help support hurricane recovery efforts. So pretty much right away, one of the first things that we did, one of our volunteers set up a co-working crowd map. One of the biggest problems after the hurricane, at least for people trying to get back to work and get back online to do some of this relief work, was that they needed a place where they could connect. They needed a place with power. So we created a crowd map where people could contribute office spaces that they had available, basically letting anybody come in who needed to plug in, who needed to connect. And that gave people an immediate ability to get back online and start contributing. And so we had this huge group of 900 volunteers. Who raised their hands, yeah.
Have charger will travel.
Have charger will travel, exactly.
How many times did we see that all over the city? So, Michael, many people have probably heard this term, Occupy Sandy, or heard some vague reference to the fact that the Occupy movement was somehow involved in Sandy relief. Can you tell us the origins of that? Because it's not the first thing that a lot of folks would think of with respect to Occupy, which was focused on other kinds of political and social goals.
Sure. I mean, so as we're talking about technology and the internet being used as a necessary tool in disaster relief kind of management, I think that beyond that, it's also activating existing networks and relationships that can step up, know how to work together, and actually start providing the aid to the places in need. And when Sandy hit, basically what we saw was that the New York network of Occupy sort of fell into gear. We already all knew each other and kind of knew how to work together because of our experience last year at Zuccotti Park. But beyond that, we also had the Inter-Occupy network, which is basically the national network of Occupy and has been coordinating through online conference calls and things like that over the last year. And so that whole network also stepped up and started assisting in this effort.
Andrew, how would you rate the New York City government's performance here through nycservice.gov or other ways that the Bloomberg administration tried to coordinate through technology?
Well, I think they're doing the best they can, considering the fact that nobody really foresaw the actual impact of this storm. I mean, the warnings were, the mayor did a good job giving people warnings, people knew to brace for it, but the actual impact just wasn't understood, and we're still learning today to understand what the true impact is. One of the reasons why we think technology can be very helpful is coordinating volunteers, and the traditional way is people sign up, people call in, people fill out forms, and then there's a volunteer list. Well, we think that technology can make the volunteer effort much, much stronger and faster, using apps and getting people pre-screened much earlier in the process and identified based on their skill sets. Not every volunteer knows how to, for example, string up a Wi-Fi network, but maybe they know how to build a website, or maybe they know how to charge 30 cell phones at the same time. They all have different skills, and they should be chronicled in some way, in an organized fashion, before the disaster strikes.
Jessica, one of my producers was volunteering and was struck by the fact that there was not a lot of technology and evidence at the beginning, and there was not a lot of coordination, therefore. So out at a shelter or a collection center, they were finding, nary a laptop in existence, and people from one shelter who didn't know what another shelter was doing or had or needed. And so he was going from one to another and finding and saying, okay, I'll text you.
Right.
Was something broke, or did it never exist in the first place?
I think it never really existed in the first place. I mean, I think that people have gotten so used to technology being such an integrated part of their lives that they forget when a disaster like this strikes, you don't have access to even the typical devices like a cell phone that you just take for granted on a daily basis. And so I think what has happened is that you have lots of people raising their hands and saying, I want to volunteer, I have supplies. And you have other people saying to media outlets, putting on Facebook, texting out, I need this, we need clothes in the Rockaways. So the message goes out, they need clothes in the Rockaways, and it gets spread all over the place. But there's no way to really turn that message off. There's not a real-time kind of needs assessment and response that can take place. So you end up with piles of clothes on the side of the street in the Rockaways
that are not
needed. And that are not needed, and yet people in Staten Island, who still might need warm coats.
Right. So, Michael, how is Occupy Sandy's website dealing with that? Do you have a tool for interagency connectivity or anything like that?
So basically what's been going on is, so far up to this point in the effort, we've been using Twitter in a very creative way, where each of the locations, each of the regions, basically, Rockaways, Staten Island, has a coordinator that is managing a Twitter account. And then they're tweeting out needs and, for volunteers, supplies, that kind of thing. And then anything that's particularly urgent, we're actually retweeting. And anything that we retweet is landing on the homepage of the OccupySandy.org website. And then next steps for this is that we're actually working with the developers of a software called Sahana Eden, which was developed during the tsunami of 2008. And it's an open source platform that we have a number of technology folks contributing to at the moment to bring it sort of up to speed for the needs of this current situation. And what that platform does is it provides a system for, need requests for supplies, volunteers, and then sending those, directly to the places that need them.
Thank you. So, Andrew, things like that, Sahana Eden, the average person with a bungalow out in the Rockaways or something like that, they don't need to know about that. Or do they? Or is it more for the organizers of service delivery?
Well, both. I mean, Google has been working very hard, and some other organizations have also worked very hard to build crisis maps, which are basically situational awareness maps. This was pioneered by an organization called Ushahidi during the Haiti earthquake, which was create a map that would allow people to text in either a problem or the resource need or a resource availability, and make it available and filterable so that whether it be organizations or agencies looking at it or citizens looking at it, you'd be able to sort of get an overall view of where, for example, where gasoline might be available, right, or where a generator might be available, or where food might be available. So understanding that crisis mapping can be now a shared process between the public and agencies is actually a concept that hasn't yet really been established, but we're hoping that now we have some time to look at it, that for future events, crisis mapping and texting into crisis mapping will augment work like Occupy Sandy is doing in order to make sure that everybody knows what's going on, where the resources are at any given time.
Jessica, do you think this is sort of a tipping point moment for technology and disaster relief, a FEMA spring, as it were?
I do. I think that this disaster in such an urban area like New York, we have so many people and so many different agencies at work on an everyday basis. But during a disaster, all of that just kind of rises to a new level. And I think in such a concentrated area, it's been an interesting case study in how you do have so many different people responding, but we really need a higher level platform for helping to coordinate all of that effort.
Michael, does that go to something that I had heard at the beginning from Occupy people, which was don't register with the government, don't go to the Red Cross if that's who's coordinating in one of the neighborhoods that people are going out to, don't go for the centralized thing, stay with the Occupy values and just start going up to people, just start going to people's homes and saying, how can I help you? Do you think that was done, first of all? Do you think it was useful, and do you think it was useful up to a point and then not?
I don't specifically remember people saying not to actually go through the more official channels. I think that as Occupy, we were wanting to provide, an alternative solution. One of the sort of key values of Occupy, I would say, is basically what ties us together is stepping up and contributing to creating the world that we want to live in. And a world with sort of mutual aid, where communities go out and help each other on a human-to-human level is just a part of that world that, is the overall vision of what I would say Occupy, wants to see come about in the world. So it was basically like taking that value and providing the vehicle for people to actually go through Occupy Sandy and, offer aid on a one-to-one level. It was really a strength that I think that Occupy brought to this situation.
Andrew, it's one thing if this was just a once-in-a-lifetime event and a horrible thing and we're never going to see anything like this again, but as Governor Cuomo put it, you stop believing something is a 100-year storm when it starts happening every 2 years.
Right.
Do you think that government is getting the message to make it different next time? I know that Senator Schumer was talking in an appearance the other day about some kind of communications infrastructure.
Well, that's right. So this isn't the first time the tech community has actually responded in some way. In fact, after September 11th, about 100 people from the tech community went down to help small businesses and schools get their networks back up and running. And in fact, I went to Senator Ron Wyden, who was then the chairman of the Senate Science and Technology Committee, and with George Allen worked together to create a bill called NetGuard, which created a national guard of techies, in effect to be available, to be pre-organized, trained, and to be deployable in the event of a disaster. And in fact, that bill passed the Senate 97-0 and became part of the Homeland Security Act. That's the good news. The bad news is that neither the Bush administration or the Obama administration has actually acted on that idea. And we're thinking that now, because of this particular incident, that we are in, that, as Jessica was pointing out, that technology has become such an integrated part of our lives that communications infrastructure, whether it's cyber attack or whether it's a hurricane attack or whether it's a terrorist attack, understanding how to get people connected and be able to be aware of where resources are and how to help each other rebuild is a critical part. And so we're hoping that now will be the time for a national tech corps to actually exist, to augment exactly the kind of work that Occupy Sandy is doing, where you take government pre-organized support, match with people's generosity and empathy, and you can actually save people's lives and save property. That
idea that I mentioned at the beginning of a Wi-Fi blimp sailing overhead in a disaster, that's your idea, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's going to have Brian Lehrer's show on the side of it.
Good. We want the logo, the frequency, exactly. Twitter feed handle, the whole thing.
Exactly.
But is that just a wacky idea, or do you think that's something?
No, actually, the FCC 3 years ago, 4 years ago, was looking at that as a solution, which is to actually float a blimp over at a disaster area to provide Wi-Fi quickly. Obviously, if the wind is blowing again, if there's another nor'easter, you can't have it. But the fact that the government's even thinking about that is indicative of the fact that people are really considering communications to be more an important part of the discussion about protecting ourselves.
And our last 30 seconds, has this incident revealed holes in the human capital, that is the skill set that we have in the Tech Meetup community, things that that now that people have to go out and learn or get different folks to come in who know?
I think in terms of a group of people for volunteering, we've got the skill set. We've got an amazing group of people that have helped everybody from FEMA to the Department of Education to individual small businesses. It's just about having a better system to harness all of that and have them prepared in the future so that when the next disaster strikes, we have a team of people already vetted at the ready.
Good. So hopefully next time through the tech community and through the community where technology meets democracy, things will be better and the area will be more ready. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Up next, the high school football team that would not forfeit to Hurricane Sandy. It was less than 2 weeks after Sandy hit. The Beach Channel high school football team from the Rockaways had been blown apart by the storm. Some players camping out in cold, dark apartments, others living with family and friends far from home. But before the storm, the Beach Channel Dolphins had made it to the playoffs and were scheduled to play Port Richmond High. Though fewer than 15% of the student body managed to get to their temporary high school for classes, the Beach Channel football team somehow got to the big game, at least many of them. Their coach, Victor Nazario, was so moved he could barely get through the pre-game pep talk. Check this out.
All right, before we take the field, gentlemen, I just want to, say a few things. You guys know how I am. Needless to say, the last 2 weeks has really tested our character and our resilience. And in my opinion, you guys passed with flying colors. I mean, the shit that you've had to deal with is ridiculous. And we're here to play football. I'm proud of you guys. Everything that you've overcome, everything that you've endured, couldn't be prouder. As far as I'm concerned, you guys are soldiers, you're warriors, you're heroes. God bless you. We didn't come here to lose this game, gentlemen. All right? We didn't come here to lose this game. It might be David versus Goliath. We got 25 bodies, they got 40. It don't matter. It don't matter.
Victor Nazario, coach of the Beach Channel Dolphins. Here to tell us about the team that would not forfeit, reporter Jeff Decker, who covered the story for the publication Gotham Schools, and Justin Zemser, co-captain of the Beach Channel Dolphins. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks.
Justin, tell us your own story to start out. Where do you live? How's your house? What'd you do after the storm hit?
Well, I live on 84th Street in Rockaway Beach. Lived there my whole life. And during the storm, like everybody else, we didn't really expect what was going to happen at all. So we, tightened down the hatches, I guess, bought a few supplies. I live on the 10th floor, so it wasn't that bad, overlooking the beach. And the storm hit. Looked outside, and I just saw the destruction just ravaged everything.
And you couldn't believe it. Did
Yes,
you evacuate?
We evacuated the day after the storm. National Guard came, all the maintenance men knocking on all the doors, and there was a gas leak in our building, so we were forced to evacuate, and I evacuated to East Islip, Long Island, where my uncle lives. So we lived with him for about 2 weeks.
Sounds like in that situation, football might be the last thing on your mind.
Yeah. I mean, it was for a short portion. I mean, in the back of my head, it was still, this is my senior year. It might have been, it is the last year I'm ever going to play football, so, I wanted to play.
And was it the first time that the team made the playoffs since you were on it?
Oh, no, we've made the playoffs every year so far. I've been on varsity for 3 years. Sophomore year, we made it to the championship, lost in the championship. Last year, we got knocked out in the first round. And this year, we were just hoping, make some magic.
So we just spent the last segment talking about how so much communication was down. Cell phones didn't work, the internet didn't work. How did you even round up your teammates?
It was pretty much the guys just got together through texting, Facebook mostly. It was just like those giant posts where you tag everybody, like 50 guys' names, just so you can respond. Pretty much just group texts. It was hard with the cell phones though, because a lot of people didn't even have, power to charge their cell phone, so it was bits and pieces.
Indeed. So Jeff from Gotham Schools, do you think there are other stories like this around the area? Maybe New Dorp High School went through a similar thing, or places in Coney Island or whatever?
Well, I know that Staten Island was obviously one of the more affected areas, and I did have a chance to speak to the New Dorp coach, and he said that while his area wasn't affected, it's a little bit higher up on Staten Island. He spent much of the previous 2 weeks helping out in the recovery efforts in other parts of Staten Island. And because of the whole school system was closed for 5 consecutive days after Sandy hit, so no schools were open, and they weren't able to practice. They were able to start at the beginning of the week, and they had a few extra days than Beach Channel High School. But yeah, I mean, I have been to Southern Brooklyn and to Far Rockaway a couple of times, and the damage to the schools that forced the schools to be closed for so long were really extreme.
And we'll come back to other kinds of damage to the schools in a minute, but pick up the story, Justin. You're texting your teammates, you're connecting on Facebook. Was there any doubt that you would all even want to get together and play this football game if people's homes were destroyed, if people were scattered to the winds of evacuation, if there were emergencies in the family? How much did you question whether you should even play?
Well, I know for a fact, for me, the number one priority was just making sure everyone was okay. So before I was even talking about football, because the kids on the team are some of the best friends that I have, so I'm calling all of them up, seeing how they're doing, trying to get in touch with everybody. And then, once you realize everyone's good, everyone's fine, their house is good, everyone starts saying, well, since you're the captain, do you know if we're playing this game on Saturday? First it was supposed to be, we had one more regular season game. That got canceled. Then it was, do you know if we're going to be playing in the playoffs this year? We want to finish the season. So then it started to escalate. Then I started talking to coaches. They didn't know. They didn't have a clue at first.
Coach Nazario, who we saw in the video, you were able to get in touch with him?
Yes, I got in touch with him. A quick text like 2 days after the storm, just to see. Not even talking about football. I asked him how he was, how his house was. He asked the same. And then a few days after, we talked, and I talked a lot with my assistant coach as well, Coach Flores. We stayed in touch a lot. He really rounded the troops, and he got out to me and our quarterback, Breland, and he pretty much told us what all the details were.
And Jeff, how'd you get onto this as a story? How'd you get this video for Gotham Schools?
Beach Channel High School was one of 65 schools that had basically been determined to be like non-operable, and on the day so the city had to come up with all of these relocation plans and new bus transportation routes for all of the schools, and it was really there's a lot of uncertainty around it, so we wanted to be at one of the schools, and the school I picked was Franklin K. Lane campus in Cypress Hill, and just so happened that I met a couple of students from Channelview High School, which is one of the schools that's located on the Beach Channel High School campus. And I met a teacher there, and he told me that there was this high school playoff football game that might be worth checking out. And so I managed to get to Far Rockaway on that Saturday morning, and the coach was, Coach Nazario was more than willing to bring me on. And so I rode the bus with him and, just followed them until they told me I couldn't film, and that never happened.
And what was their mood? We saw the mood of the coach in his pregame pep talk. What did it look like to you?
The mood on the bus ride, I was expecting them to be, a lot of these guys were reuniting for the first time. They had a couple of practices before, but this is the first extended time that they were having together, and I thought they'd be swapping war stories about where they'd been, but it was pretty surprising to see how easily it seemed that they fell right back into like routines of prepping, a lot of joking. A lot of these guys were clearly really close friends, and I think they enjoyed like that time speaking with one another. So it wasn't until after the game finished that I think like the whole team like really opened up and became really emotional. And for the seniors, they realized that it was their last game, and that's when they sort of started to talk a little bit more about what was facing them next, going back to the dark.
So tell us a little bit about the game itself. You were serious underdogs going in, especially under these circumstances, right?
Yes, sir. The game going in, we were underdogs, but, looking back, talking to the team, there's no doubt that we thought that we could win, obviously, because, we're a confident bunch. We have great players, great coaches. So, going in, I was really looking forward to, getting film on them, practicing for them. But, obviously the circumstances, that stuff was just impossible.
Plus, you had 25 players to their 40, right?
True. I mean, the numbers were lopsided, but I mean, I don't think that's not much of an excuse. I mean, we went out there with a solid 11 on both ways, and came down to who was better pretty much on that day.
So, the final score?
The final score, 38-6, not in our favor.
I should note that an interesting story like this, they might not have even had equipment. Your Coach Nazario told me a story that he, a couple of years ago, installed hooks that were high enough in the locker room and the way that you guys hung the equipment, it was high enough so that when the water came in, it ruined a lot of the wood flooring, but it didn't get high enough to ruin the padding and the jersey. And I thought that was pretty interesting. They very well could have just not had uniforms to play.
So we saw the video of the coach with the pregame pep talk. After the game, the students huddled one last time. Do you want to set this up for us? Who is this?
This is my best friend, Folorunsu Fatukasi. He's a defensive lineman committed to the University of Connecticut, and he's a team leader. He's a great guy, you know.
Check it out.
I appreciate it. Because we had teams this year talking about we belong in the one, and we're in the playoffs. We're in the playoffs. Regardless of what happened today, I believe that all of us gave it 110%. I believe that all of us gave it 110%. That's all I gotta say, son. Yo, no one cries, son. Yo, keep your heads up, because we came this far with all that adversity against us. We came this far.
We'll be thankful for that.
And we're leaving this field with respect.
That's right.
We're leaving this field with respect. And dignity.
Guys,
And pride.
champions, all of you. Told you guys,
That's it.
all of you.
All right, so it sounds like he's set up to be a good player and maybe a good coach someday if he's giving talks like that, right?
Yeah, he's a phenomenal guy. You know, all year he was really instrumental in keeping our team running. You know, he's the best player in our team, you know, and he sets the tone.
Is school back in at Beach Channel?
Not at Beach Channel. We got relocated to Franklin K. Lane, and pretty much we go there every day. You know, they're trying to resume normalcy there. I'm still in my same class with my same teachers, but we pretty much stay in the same room all day.
What's the like getting all the way out there? Because that's in the Cypress Hills area, right? And so are you back at home in the Rockaways?
Yeah.
But going out there every day?
Yeah, I was going from Islip to K Lane every day, taking the LIRR, but we just came back to Rockaway on Saturday night. So now they have a shuttle bus outside our campus.
Specifically for the students?
Yeah, specifically for the students, and it takes us right to the school. So that's not really a hassle getting there.
And Jeff, is there any way to say whether, you know, or when the whole school system might be back in shape with all the facilities, kids can go to their own schools again?
The city thinks it'll be by close to the beginning of the new year, like the last school. But they've said that Beach Channel High School campus will be ready by November 30th. They announced that 12 schools today had opened today ahead of schedule, and so now there's 18 schools that are still basically in relocated classrooms. It's something like 8,000 students still, which is a lot, but when you consider that when in the storm's immediate aftermath, 65 schools were rendered non-operable, the progress has been pretty quick, a lot faster than we reporters expected.
Well, congratulations on getting this story.
Thanks.
Congratulations on having so much heart.
Thank you.
And your teammates. Good luck to you.
Thank you, you too.
And up next, America the Segregated. Why, 40 years after the Civil Rights Movement and laws designed to make things right, are America's neighborhoods still largely segregated? Nicole Hannah-Jones, an investigative reporter with the nonprofit news outlet ProPublica, recently completed a two-part investigation into what could be called apartheid light. It's a sobering look at the federal government's failure to enforce a little-known desegregation provision of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Hannah-Jones's year-long investigation goes a long way toward explaining why we are still living apart. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So you're doing kind of a report card for the federal government 40 years after that act, right?
You could say that.
Was there an overall grade?
As a reporter, it's difficult to give a grade, but I think we found that it would probably be a D minus.
D minus?
Yes.
That would never go over at Beach Channel High School. Why a D minus? Why is it that bad?
Well, we found that since the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, you basically had a succession of presidents, both Democratic and Republican, who ignored that provision of the law that said they had to use the federal government's powers to dismantle the segregation that the government helped create.
The desegregation that the government helped create.
That's correct.
Explain where that line is between desegregation that people did on their own, segregation that people did on their own, and segregation that the government created.
So there's this myth that segregation kind of came about because people wanted to live where they wanted to live, or people could only live in certain areas because they could only afford to live in certain areas. But my investigation found that there had been a very long history of the government, the federal government, as well as local and state governments, actively playing a role in segregation, starting with, you had the federal government as early as the early 1900s began to implement racial zoning, which prohibited African Americans from living in white neighborhoods and vice versa. After that, you had the government went on with the loans, the federal loan programs, including the GI Bill, including the Federal Housing Administration, explicitly segregated. So in the provisions for those loans, they didn't want racial mixing, and so they wouldn't insure loans in integrated neighborhoods. Explicitly required, in some cases, racial covenants in new suburbs that were being built with federal dollars.
So this applies in part to our own area, particularly Westchester County, which had to do with part 2 of your investigation. Tell us about your local angle.
So you had this long history of the federal government pretty much not enforcing the Fair Housing Act. And what the provision said was that there's a big grant program called the Community Development Block Grant Program, and it's the largest block grant program that the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development disperses. And it pretty much comes with no strings. Communities get it every year, but one thing they have to do is they have to certify that they're following the Fair Housing Act, that they're not discriminating and they're not perpetuating segregation. But the thing is, the federal government never made really any community prove that. They just kept giving the money, even though communities were spending the dollars in ways that oftentimes certainly didn't eradicate segregation, but often increased it. So you had this law firm, it's actually a nonprofit group called the Anti-Discrimination Center, and its leader, Craig Gurian, said, I'm going to find a way to get the government to enforce this law. And so he looked at Westchester County and found that that county had been making certifications to the government and received about $50 million that he believed they'd received fraudulently because they were only putting affordable housing in heavily minority areas, and a lot of the very affluent white parts of Westchester County simply refused to build affordable housing, and the county didn't do anything to make them.
So what would the law require, as you understand it? Would it require housing projects or something like that to be put in Chappaqua where the Clintons live, or, what's the extent of what you think the law requires?
Well, affordable housing isn't necessarily public housing, and I think that's a big myth that people have. Affordable housing, as defined by the federal government, is for people who make up to 80% of the median income, which in Westchester County can be about $80,000 a year. That's definitely not low-income housing. But what affordable housing also tends to be are multifamily housing, because if you can put a bunch of units on one piece of land, that automatically makes it cheaper, and rental housing. And the reason that's important is African Americans and Latinos, only about 44% of them are homeowners versus about 75% of white Americans. So if you eliminate rental housing, you're eliminating more than half of the Black and Latino population just by doing that. So what the law, at least the way that George Romney, who was Mitt Romney's father and the first HUD secretary after the act was passed, he saw the law as meaning that if the federal government's going to give these communities money, then they need to be open to affordable housing. They need to be open to housing that was going to integrate them. And if they weren't open to that, then the federal government shouldn't give them money.
I guess Mitt Romney would call that gifts to constituents to get out to vote, but that's another story. In the course of your reporting, have you uncovered communities that are following the law, that are good models anywhere in America of integrating housing or desegregating housing as the 1968 law seemed to require?
I think that's an important question, and that's one that we felt was important to answer for our readers as well. It's easy to paint all of the things that are wrong with enforcement, but if you don't give people an alternative vision, then it's hard to to show them that things didn't have to be the way that they are. One place that we focused on was Montgomery County, Maryland, which is a very wealthy suburb of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is one of the most segregated cities in the country. But at the same time, a couple years after the Fair Housing Act was passed, when lots of other communities were putting up exclusionary zoning to block affordable housing, Montgomery County implemented the nation's first mandatory inclusionary zoning ordinance. And it took them 6 years to do it. It wasn't an easy fight, but they felt it was important that you weren't just going to group affordable housing in these isolated, kind of destitute pockets, but that every community, from the wealthiest to the poorest, should have its fair share of affordable housing. And they've been highly successful. They're far more integrated than the nation as a whole. They've produced 13,000 units of affordable housing, which is the most of any ordinance in the country. And you have, you know, from Potomac, you're finding actual housing projects, public housing in Potomac, which is one of the richest zip codes in the country.
Is this more about class or income than it is about race, about stopping the slide in America to just living among people of your own income group? I think housing used to be more, you know, neighborhoods used to be more income diverse, but over many, many, many decades, people have started living in neighborhoods that are defined by property values. So is this more about income than it is about race?
I think that's a common perception. You heard it from Rob Astorino, who's the county executive in Westchester County, and you really hear it all the time. And so we wanted to investigate that, and other scholars have investigated this as well. And what they found is that income actually accounts for only a percentage of the segregation, particularly that African Americans face. Wealthier African Americans are living actually in poorer neighborhoods than poor whites. So it's certainly not just income. And in Westchester, we actually mapped it using census data and found that Westchester would be vastly more integrated if its black residents lived among white residents with similar income. One of the things is that African Americans often don't have the wealth. So even though you could be making the same income as a white person, African American wealth is about 20 times less than white Americans. So it makes it harder to come up with a down payment to buy into these communities, which is why rental housing, affordable rental housing is so important. But even if you take wealth totally out of it, you're going to see a high degree of racial segregation for African Americans and to a lesser extent Latinos.
So what happens next? Now that you've done this investigative report, does the law get enforced in a different way? Does someone bring a lawsuit based on your findings? How does this affect change?
Well, what we're hoping, one of the things we spotlighted is the Obama administration promised it was going to release new regulations that would better hold communities accountable for how they were spending federal dollars and for compliance with the law. That was 2 years ago, and the Obama administration has yet to release it. And my sources said they were waiting until after the election. So the election has happened, Obama was reelected, so we're going to continue to apply pressure and hopefully get those regulations released.
All right, well, they say elections have consequences. We'll see if it has consequences in this area. Thank you for your reporting.
Thank you.
Coming up next, a new way to see Africa through new art after the break. With fresh ideas and inventive exhibits, major museums in the United States are challenging outdated perceptions that many of us hold about African art. Yes, wood-carved masks are still in vogue in the ancient civilizations wing, but today one can also enjoy modern multimedia works by African artists on display at places like the David Crut Gallery in Chelsea, the Newark Museum in New Jersey, and at the Smithsonian Museum of African Art in Washington, D.C. We have three guests in the forefront of expanding the image of African art. Krista Clark is Senior Curator of the Arts of Africa and the Americas at the Newark Museum. Moroccan-born artist Lala Assaidi is here too. She has work on display right now, and she makes her home here in New York City. And joining us via Skype from the Walters Museum in Baltimore is curator Joneith Spicer, whose Africans in Renaissance Europe exhibit has drawn critical praise, most recently from the New York Times. Welcome to all of you. Hello.
Hello.
And Krista, are we making progress, or do people still think, for example, that Africa is a country?
People definitely still think Africa is a country, but we are making progress. I think that You know, about 100 years ago, when we first started seeing African art presented as art in museums and galleries in the US and Europe, there was a very narrow definition of what constitutes African art. And you referred to the masks and figures that are very familiar to our audiences. And you also mentioned that these are the kinds of things you'd see in an ancient civilization wing. Actually, most of the masks and figures you see in museums were made in the 19th, early 20th century. So, you know.
So let's show an example of that
Sure.
right away, because we have about 4 images that we're going to show from the Newark Museum, from your collection. And let's see if we can put this first one up on the screen. And this, sure enough, is a mask, isn't it?
This is actually what's known as a reliquary guardian figure. It's a piece that would have sat and guarded relics of an important ancestor.
What's the actual size of this? It's hard to tell whether it's, you know, a little piece of jewelry or a whole wall or what it is.
It's about a little over a foot, you know, about 15 inches height, I think. And it's a work that's made in Gabon, was made in Gabon probably in the late 19th, early 20th century. Came into the Newark Museum's collection in 1924. And it's the kind of work I think we think about when we think about African art, because it's the kind of work that inspired early modernists like Picasso and Matisse, who were very much taken with this highly abstract definition of the human body, which you see in a work like this, and the kind of faceted planes.
And it makes your point, because many people seeing this for the first time might think that it comes from an ancient civilization's wing of a museum or something like that, but it's around 1900.
Well, yeah, 1900, maybe a little earlier, but it's, you know, it's no coincidence that we think of this as ancient, because when African art first started being discussed as art, a lot of these early critics were constructing it as an ancient art form, as an ancient civilization. And of course, African art goes back to the beginnings of, you know, the creation of art, but this particular work was probably made during the colonial period.
So let's go to another slide and tell us what we're seeing here.
Right here you're looking at a 17th century Ethiopian diptych icon. It's actually a double-sided piece. And this is a work that I think may surprise people to be under the umbrella of African art, because I think a lot of people don't think of art from Ethiopia as African art, in large part because there's a lot of Christian iconography.
And this is a Madonna and Child. Yeah?
It's a Madonna and Child. The iconography is coming straight from Rome, and you know, Ethiopia, the state religion was Christianity beginning in the 4th century, and so Christianity has deep roots, and it is as much an African tradition as European art historical tradition.
And we're going to show 2 more from the collection at your space. But Lala, I wonder what you're thinking as an artist who came here from Morocco, watching just even these 2 slides.
It's very interesting to me that because of their fate, this painting is not accepted as an African art piece, because we're talking about the Ethiopian one. And I relate in that because my own personal identity being questioned as an African, because the theme within my work comes a little bit from the Middle East, because I have all these identities. I am Moroccan and I'm Arab, and most of the time I'm not considered African because of the Arab part of my identity, I believe. And I'm seeing that repeating itself in this painting because of their fate. They're not considered African.
And we'll see some of your work in just a minute, but let's go back to the newer collection and see another work. What's this?
This is a work that was made within the past decade by the Ghanaian-born artist El Anatsui, who now lives and works in Nigeria. And it's a work called Many Came Back. This is actually a much larger work. It's about, I guess, about 6 feet wide. And it's made entirely out of discarded liquor bottle caps, which are flattened and crushed and crumpled and then sewn together to create what the artist calls as this giant, wall cloth or metal sculpture. And part of what the artist is doing is, in some ways, referencing the tradition of kente cloth in his homeland of Ghana. But really, he's an artist that is, speaks to the international art world as somebody who's very much interested in exploring different kinds of materials. And this is a work that sits as comfortably at the Venice Biennale as it would in Nigeria or Ghana.
Yeah, I was going to say, it looks like something that a New York contemporary artist might have come up with to explore you know.
Consumerism,
Could-
for instance.
Yes, why
Absolutely,
consumerism?
yeah.
Why consumerism?
Because of the material he's using, all these cans and all these, you know, and also just like you explained, these are a huge mural in a way, and that they have that theatrical emphasis of that same idea of consumerism. It's just bringing it over the top to make a point.
And that's one of many themes he's
Right.
exploring in this work, because as Lala was talking about with her identity, I mean, for this artist, part of his identity is responding to a Ghanaian textile tradition, but part of it is responding to consumerism. Part of it, it's multiple things happening in this work, and I think that's what really complicates the notion of African art.
It's cyclical too, in a way, because it's the traditional kente cloth giving way to the consumer metals, but then
Yes.
the consumer metals are used to be transformed into a representation of a kente cloth.
Exactly. Well, it is, I mean, it's a reference to it. I mean, I think there are multiple things happening, and I think that that's what artists like Lala and Elle are, about today, is that your work can reference many things at once, and it doesn't have to be about one idea of Africa, whatever that means.
Let's see one more slide.
Well, that's what I think makes them contemporary, because we're dealing with contemporary experiences that wasn't present before. So automatically, as artists, we have to include that because it's such a big part of our life. So sometimes we don't even plan to include things, but it's just the way we see things happen around us.
Now, tell us what we're seeing on the screen right now.
This is one of Lala's works from her Converging Territories series, and it's actually one of two works that the New York Museum owns. This is currently on view in our American art galleries, and her other work is on view in our African art galleries. And it's one of the ways that we can, provoke ideas amongst our visitors about how these contemporary artists are sometimes defined by geography. My challenge as a curator of African art is to explode the idea of Africa and to embrace a contemporary artist. But of course, an artist like Lala doesn't want to be defined exclusively by geography. So showing her work in these two contexts is one of the ways we challenge that.
And Lala, tell us more about this work. What are we actually looking at here? What materials, or is this a photograph of a person doing an installation?
It's a photograph of a person writing on herself, and all the cloth around her is written, and she's using the henna, which is a medium that is used by women in my country to decorate the hands and the feet, but she's using also an ancient way of writing, which is calligraphy, which is considered high art, and it's automatically male art, and I am trying male art, high art, male art, which is for men, because it's within Islamic culture or art history, and it's the architecture and poetry and calligraphy are considered high art. You don't see so much women doing that. And so for me, it's a male art, and I try to appropriate male art and use it with the female medium to try and create something that can speak to people, to create a dialogue, really, because so the woman is writing her own story on herself, and I don't think of them simply as photographs, because it takes such a long time of preparation, sometimes up to 6 months of preparation.
Could that have been, do you think, in an African art exhibit in New York even 2 years ago?
It was in an art
It was.
exhibit 2 years ago.
It was.
Yes.
I guess I'm trying to get a sense
Right.
of how fast things are changing in the
Well,
curatorial
definitely.
world to include this broader vision.
Yes, definitely. I mean, when 9/11 happened, I was just finishing grad school and starting showing, and I've been hearing a lot of people talking how I'm lucky because there is a certain awareness about the Arabs, about the calligraphy, about all these kind of things, and how it's going to help me in my work to get to the audiences because of that. For sure, it did help in a sense, but I think that it was very important for me to show it here, but maybe if it wasn't for 9/11 at that time, it may have taken a longer time, perhaps, for people to realize that it is important. But after that, you know, the book that was read the most in the whole world was the Quran, and so everybody think that they were curious about the culture and where I come from, and almost there is a feel that if they know more about that culture, somehow they'll be safer.
Yes.
So I think that my work was in that category at that time. So
let's look at a piece of your current work. Is
Right.
this a triptych, a 3-panel piece?
Right. And this is from the series Harem. And also my work is informed by Orientalist painting and the presentation of Arab women within Western art tradition. And there are 3 themes within these paintings, which is they deal with the odalisque, the veil, and the harem. So this is part, so my work comes in a triptych form, and this is the harem part, and this is literally a real harem of an old palace in Morocco. And the harem means it's really the quarters where women live. And so usually I don't include so much architecture in my work, but it was necessary that people will see what the space is about.
And this is a close-up of the center
This is
of
another,
the 3 pieces?
yes, this
or
is
different?
another piece. This is another piece on its own, but it's also within that same space. I work in series where I would have several photographs of the same theme.
How did you make this?
Well, what I do is, first of all, I go to the same space and I have to spend some time there, and just to try and find a way of how I'm going to convey that idea of the harem itself. So,
And we're just about out of time. Where can people see your work today? Where can they go?
they can go to the museum, the National Museum, the Smithsonian in DC. They can see it at Edwin Howe Gallery in New York.
The Newark Museum.
The Newark Museum, among others.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. And how long is your current exhibit of African art running at the Newark Museum, or is it part of the permanent collection?
It's part of the permanent collection. We have one of the oldest collections in the country, so it'll always be there, and we're doing a big reinstallation and expansion in the next couple of years too, so there'll be even more on view.
Well, thank you for the tour of the beautiful images and their meaning. We really appreciate it, and we apologize for not being able to follow up with our guest from Baltimore because of technical difficulties. And that's it for our program for today. We roll out a new show each Wednesday evening at 7:30. Next time, after Black Friday, Retail Madness. And tune into my radio program weekdays at 10 a.m. on WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Happy Thanksgiving.